Hello, in this video I am going to do yet another exercise with Linq and show you a different way you can incorporate that into your programs. And this is actually a little bit more powerful than what we've seen before. We've looked at processing XML files, we've looked at working with objects in memory, but in this activity I'm going to show you how to actually connect to an SQL data source and perform Linq queries on that. So hopefully you're starting to see how Linq really ties a lot of different data sources together, so you just have to learn one set of language features in order to access them. So in this exercise, I'm just going to recreate the weather program, except rather than getting the weather from an XML file, I'm actually going to get it from an SQL database. Actually, I'm not going to get it directly from a database. I've stopped a database and I've pulled the file out. And I do that because in class we don't have SQL Server to connect to, but if I give people the database file, they can connect to it, and that works. However, the process for connecting to the data source is exactly the same, whether it's a file or whether it's actually a server. So it's not going to make too much of a difference in this activity. If you want to actually play with a real database, you can get SQL Server Community Edition and connect to that. I will let you know, though, there is a security setting that you will have to change to specify whether you want Windows authentication or SQL Server authentication, and I found that after wasting a whole lot of my life looking through log files. So if you're trying to connect and it's not working, open up SQL Server and change the authentication setting from Windows to SQL Server authentication. All right, enough of that digression. I'm going to create a new format here, which we have done a million times. Demo 2, there we go. Which we've done a billion times so far. So I've just thrown a menu strip on there just to save some time. It just has an exit and a help about, like every Windows program seems to. And last time when I did the XML demo, I kept kind of wishing, I wish I'd used a data grid control. That's a little bit more fun than a list box, a little easier to work with. So we'll use data grid controls in this to show us the hottest cities, the coldest cities, highest pressure, lowest pressure. And rather than have all these different grids on one form, what I'll do is use a tab control. Tab controls are really slick, and I will just drag a tab control onto my form. So I can add new tabs onto here and switch between them, and that way I can kind of pack a lot more information into a smaller space. And to drag, I can go into my toolbox, I can drag controls onto this tab right here, or I can click on this tab here and drag controls onto there. And just be careful, there's you can click on the tab, and you can also click on the just kind of this area in the middle. So there's different, you have to kind of be careful or cognizant of what you've actually clicked on. So let's pull up the properties for the tabs here. And so if I pull up the properties, what you want to do is go down here to the tab pages. And for that to work, you want to make sure that you're selecting the entire control here. So I've got the bounding box that includes the tabs, right? All that whole thing. I just want to right-click on that and select properties. Or I could go down here into the bottom right. I could dock the properties window. And what you want to find is the tab pages collection right here. This thing. And if you click on that, you'll notice you get 3 dots. So you can expand that. And if you click on that, this is where you can set the different properties for each tab page, or you can add more tabs. So let me go down here. I can change the text property for just that tab, and I'll just say I'll select the hottest cities. Let's call it hottest, coldest, and lowest, or whatever. Okay, so, and now you can see over here in the tab, you can see that the text has changed to hottest, and then over in the tab page here, let me go back to the control, whoops, and I want to find the tab pages, and I want to find the 3 dots. There we go, open that up, and now let me go to tab 2 here, and I'll change that to be coldest. And let's say we need some more tabs for like the different barometric pressures. So let me add, I'll click the add button to add some more tab pages there. And then for tab 3, let me throw in there, let's call it like, highest baro for barometric pressure. And for the 4th one, I'll set its text to lowest baro. And then, maybe we want a tab 2 for current conditions or something. I don't know, maybe we wanted that tab first. I'll just call it like, or by city or something. Select the current conditions by city. And I wonder if I can reorder them within the the order. Yes, I can. So I could actually take this tab and bump it up there, and you can see if I click OK, by city is now the first tab there. So there's my tab control. Tab controls are just super, super nice. And then let's drag data grid controls onto at least the last 4 forms. I don't know what we'll do with the by city one. So let's go to the oops, I went on the wrong tab. Oops, all right, there we go. So there's the hottest tab. Now I'm on that. So let me drag a data grid view over onto there. And I'm not much of a user interface designer, I will fess up. And then let me copy that data grid, and I'm going to click on the next tab. Oops, why can't I do that? I cannot paste it from one tab to another. That is very irritating. All right, I guess I just have to drag it on there. I still hate it less than XAML. Doesn't that seem like a long time ago we were struggling with that? Let's drag another data grid view on there. Now, once we're done, we can go and actually set the coordinates, the left and right, coordinates for all these controls. And so it looks all pretty. There we go. We'll mess with that later, but the whole thing is just get a nice kind of interface with some data grids on there, and then we'll pretty it up later. So now comes the part where we integrate the data source into our project. So this is going to be an item that we add to our existing project. It's not a new project within a solution. It's actually an item that we're going to add to an existing project. So if I right-click on my Linq to SQL Demo 2 project right here, what I'm going to do is go down, I'm going to find Add, and I want to find New Item right there, New Item. And one of the options will be ADO.NET Entity Data Model. So this is the component that's going to go into the database, and it's going to look at the schema, and it's going to create the class wrappers around all of the objects. So remember way back in the program where I built, I don't know if it was the GameStop database, right? And I had to build all the objects manually by hand and create the wrappers for the data. Entity Framework can do that for you. It just looks at the schema for the database, and it will create the class wrappers that will enclose or wrap the rows from the tables, or the data in the tables. And let's call this, I'm going to call it like weather model, because that's what's in this data model. I'm going to call it like the weather model or something, the weather data model. You can call it whatever you want. And then I'll click Add. And now it's going to pull up this wizard. And we're going to walk through how to go through the wizard so you can connect to a data source. And what we want here is Entity Framework Designer from database. And it doesn't matter whether it's actually a database server or it's just a database file that we kind of pulled away from a server or snuck out from a server when the server wasn't looking. So we want this one on the left here. And then let's click Next. And now we've got some stuff to configure here. I'm going to click Cancel. My database was... All right. So now what we need to do is create a new connection. So I've been playing around with this stuff before, and you can see that I've been running SQL Server Express. That's the kind of free SQL Server. That's why that error popped up. But what I want to do is create a new connection. And you'll have some. So remember, I was telling you it's kind of the same whether you connect to a file or whether you connect to a server. That's what this deal here is. So for the data source, we can actually we can pick a different data source. So I'm going to click the change button here, and see now I can select either a server to connect to, and then which point I want to provide my connection string criteria like the username and password, or I can actually just select a database file like an MDF file, which is what we're going to use. And the project resources for this actually have an MDF file, so it's not like I'm just like making this up and I'm not sharing it. No, the MDF files are in the resources. All right, and now what I can do is I'm going to browse out to that database file. And it should be somewhere lost in my hard drive of doom. And I don't know what week this thing ends up in. Okay, so let me pick one here. I'm going to pick the weather data full. That sounds like a good one. Whatever one I supplied with the resources, that's the one you want to pick. So I'll pick the full one here. And you can see that now it's showing up in the wizard. And here's that setting I was saying, use Windows authentication or use SQL Server authentication. If you're connecting to a server, the server is configured to use one of these two security mechanisms. So you have to make sure that the security mechanism that you are using matches the security mechanism that the database is using. Otherwise, you're going to get, it'll just say like couldn't connect, and it's not going to be obvious why. But if you go looking through the log files for the server, you will see that it will say somebody tried to connect with like one type of authentication, but you've specified this type of authentication. That's what's going on here. So once you've got your stuff entered, let's just click test connection just to verify that it works. Test connection succeeded. Yay! Oh my gosh, it's wonderful. It's amazing. I have no idea what the wizard does or how it works, but it's amazing. So let's click OK now. And now what we want to do is provide a name for our entity model. And I think entities is just kind of lame. Let's give it a good name. Let's call it weather entities, because weather database entities. You want to give this thing a descriptive name. I'm just going to call it weather entities. And now this is going to be the class hierarchy that wraps the tables in the database. So it says uses a local data that is not okay. So what does this matter? Well, kind of yes and no. If you want to modify the data, click no, because it's asking if you want to make a copy of the data. And so why would you, if you want to modify it, then no, you don't want to make a copy of it. You want to modify the real data. So I am just going to say, would you like to copy the file into your project and modify the connection? I'll just say yes, but no, you know what? I'll say no. I'll say no. There you go. It doesn't really matter, though. Except if you want to modify the data. So if you're going to be deleting or altering records, you want to modify the actual file, and you don't want to create a copy of that in your solution. So that's what that setting means. And then I'm just going to click next. And okay, so now let's say we want to bring in our tables, pluralize. Yeah, okay, we can leave that checked. That's like if it sees like city, it'll add cities on the end, or weather, it'll add weathers. I don't know. You know what? I'm gonna leave that unchecked. And then we can give our thing a name here. Let's call it like weather model. And then let's click finish. And what Entity Framework will do is now it's going to go into the database file, and it's going to look at the schema for those tables, and it's going to build the class wrappers. So we don't have to do this by hand. Like imagine if you had like a huge production database and how tedious that would be to try to make class wrappers for all the stuff and load them, like build them yourself. No, there's tools for doing that. So that actually took, I don't know, 30 seconds to complete. But now you can see, if you kind of explore around in here, weather model, entity types, weather data, ID, city, pressure, sky, temperature. So these are the fields in our weather data object that correspond to the columns in our database. And if I close this now, and you can actually see it's like generated like a kind of a class, or a kind of almost a database schema here. Let me close this. Now we can go looking through our solution, and we can actually take a look at what it actually generated for us. So let's take a look through some of the files that got created for us. If you just start expanding the folders, you can see that, or you expanding the items, you can see there's a class in here called weatherdata.cs. Let's go look at that. That's what's being displayed here. And you notice what it did was it generated a class that encapsulates all of the fields in the weather data table. So that database file had a table in it called weather data, and each one of these are the columns in that table. So this represents one row out of that table. And let's take a look at some other stuff here. Why are some of these fields nullable? What does it mean to be nullable? What is a nullable? A nullable of type integer. When you are retrieving information out of a database, there's always the possibility that that data could be null. So apparently on the city name isn't set to, well, that has to be there. So because it's not nullable. But there's always a chance when the database is configured that fields don't have to have values, like a second phone number or second street address or something like that. They're fields in the database, but they may not have a value. And if they don't have a value, then they're null. They could be null. So a nullable means it could have a value or it could be null. That's what nullable is used for. Now there's another more important or equally important class in here, and that is this file that has the context.cs. That's the one that you want to go looking for. So if you open this context.cs file and take a look at what is in here, you'll see this class, weather entities, that inherits a database context. A context is an interface to something. It could be like a device context, a drawing context. A context is a way of talking to something. So the weather entities class here is our interface to the database. So to talk to our database, all we have to do is instantiate one of these contexts, one of these weather entities. And notice that it actually has a database set of weather data. So this weather entities is the wrapper for all of our tables. If we had more tables, they would all show up here. This database file only has one table, and it's just the weather entries. So that's why there's only one collection of objects in there. So if this were a more complicated database, we would have more collections in here. So let's pop back over to our form, and in the constructor, let's instantiate one of these things, because once we have it, then we can perform Linq queries on it and populate our data grid controls. So let me go back to my form here, and let me get to the code. There we go. So here's my form. So inside of my class, I will add a weather entities object here, and I will call it WX entities for weather entities. And I'm not going to allocate it yet. There we go. Okay. And you can see there, that file, it even gave us the same namespace, so we don't have to do a using statement or dots or anything like that. So what are we going to do now? Let's go create this thing in our constructor. And so let's call it WX. We'll actually instantiate it equals new weather entities. Now, would you imagine that it is very important that this database connection, reference, whatever it is, gets closed when we're done with it? Yes, absolutely. So how do we know that it wants us to do that? Well, if you kind of use the IntelliSense and start digging through here, you'll see it has a dispose method, right? So the dispose is kind of like its constructor. That should get called when we're done using this resource. So how do we make sure that the dispose gets called automatically? Well, we use a using statement. That is one of the most important things in C# is the using statement. If I were interviewing people for a job and they knew what using was, I would say that's good. If they don't know what using is, that is bad. So remember, using is a shortcut for try, finally, and in the finally, we call the dispose method on the thing we're using. So this will make sure that the dispose method on weather entities is actually called. Now let's rather than stuffing everything into this one little using statement, let's make a function called like populate, or we'll call it hottest cities or something like that. And then let me make a function to actually go do that. Void hottest cities. All right, so now can I do some Linq queries on this thing? Yes, I can. That's what it's for. So what's our query going to look like? Let's use var for our result set. Var means let the compiler figure out what the heck the type of this thing is. And let's just call it results equals. Then let's write our Linq query. What's the first thing in a Linq query? The from statement. From, we'll say from C, or we'll call it W for for weather. And then what collection are we performing the Linq query on? Well, that's our weather entities. And remember, that contained a collection of our weather data. There it is. There it is, weather data. All right. From W and WX entities.weather data. And then if we just want to select the city or W, that'll select everything. But I don't want everything. I want to order these things by temperature. Order them by temperature descending. So that'll give me all of the cities in descending order. But maybe I don't want all of them. Maybe I just want like 5 of them or 10 of them. So let's put parentheses around this whole thing. Let's say dot take 10 or 5. I don't know. Take 10. Okay. Well, that's pretty good, I guess. Yep. And then like let's say we just wanted the name and the temperature, then we could select a new, and then inside our parentheses w dot city, w dot temp. Oh, no. Right, so that will create a new object on the fly that's got those properties. And that's why we need var, because I don't know the name of this object. The compiler made it up for us. Now let's get this thing into our data grid. So data grid, it's data grid view 1 dot, and then just dump data in there. We use its data source property. Data source equals results. Now this is not going to work because the data source needs to be wired up to a list or an array. This thing is an IEnumerable of something, and even though it doesn't crash, it doesn't actually work either. So actually, if we just do toList, I think that'll work. I think that shall work. So, and then remember, Linq queries have deferred execution. So even though we're kind of writing the query here, it doesn't actually get populated until somebody tries to use the results of the query. So let's just put a breakpoint in here and run this thing and see if it works. So F5 to run it, and there it is using WX entities. And if you want to hit F11, you can kind of try to step down in there, although it doesn't actually seem to do much. And now look, so now our weather entities is created. And what's in there? Oh, look, like if we look in there with the debugger, you can see that there's a weather data thingy there. And it says this function evaluation requires all threads to run. Okay, not quite sure what that means, but now let's go into our hottest cities. And now it is going to execute our Linq query. And there's our results. It's who knows what the type of that thing is. It's system data entity infrastructure DB query. Oh God, of all sorts of nullable things. The important thing is though, we don't need to know that. That's what var is for. Var means let the compiler figure out what that long, horrible type is, and then let's take our results and dump them into data grid view 1. And I'm going to hit F5 to continue. And if I go to the tab with the hottest cities, oh my God, look, Honolulu, temperature 79. There you go. Very nice. Now the weather data is old. I did not update the database. Databases and I are not really best friends. So there's an example of how to get data actually out of an MDF file or a database and perform Linq queries on it inside of a form application. Before we finish this up, though, let's look at that first tab. I didn't feel right just kind of leaving that up in the air. And here I've mocked up that interface where we've got the text box. We can type in a city name, and then we'll see information over here. What is this control over here? I've actually never used one of these controls before. This is a property grid control. It's like a data grid view, except kind of rotated on its side. I guess database people would call this a pivot table, or the data would be pivoted. So it'll show the column headers down the left and the values, in a column on the right. So it'll just look a little bit better than just having a data grid view with one line in it. So let's see what that looks like for us. And we should, to make the query or to create the event handler that triggers the query, let's double click on the little button here. And now we're in our button click function. So right away we've got an issue, and that is, remember this thing, the using statement? Well, when this using statement terminates, the dispose function on the weather entities gets called. So the database connection gets closed. So we can't use weather entities down here unless we kind of recreate it or reopen that connection. So to do that, I'm just going to grab that and paste it down here. And I'll get rid of that function call right there. So I have to kind of reestablish the connection to that file, because when I used the whole purpose of the using statement is to make sure the thing gets closed. So if we don't kind of recreate it or reopen the connection to the file, it'll blow up. It'll throw an exception saying, well, you're trying to use a resource that's already been disposed. So inside this using statement, let's write ourselves a query that will select out the city that has the name that's been entered in that text box, if such a city can be found in the data. So let's make a var results, that's our result set, equals, and then, okay, remember, from, that's always the first line. We'll call it like W in WX entities dot weather data select W. Now that's going to get us everything. We don't want everything. We just want the city whose name, or the entry with a city name that matches what was in the text box. So let's filter this using a where clause, where W's city is equal to the value in that text box up here. So what this is, text box 1. So text box 1.text. There we go. Now, just to be kind of pedantic, what happens if the data's got it uppercase C and the person types in lowercase c? How could we get it to match? Well, in cases like that, you just you can convert them both to uppercase or both to lowercase to upper. And you might want to, you could also trim them in case like there was a trailing space or something. So that will select the city, and then that. But what if there's like, there could be like 25 Springfields. So let's do a take 1. We'll just take the first result. So results has a list that has 0 or 1 things in it. So now let's do our check to make sure that the results actually came back. So let's see, what have we got in results? If results.count is greater than 0, which means it has something, else it doesn't have anything. So let's pop up a message box, messagebox.show. We'll put in city not found, city not found, city not found. It's so sad. All right, and then in here, let's display the info for the city in that property grid control. Now, results is a list that has one thing in it. We don't want to put results in the property grid control. We want to put the first element in results in the property grid control. So this is a list. We don't want to put the list in the property control. We want to put the first thing in the list in the property control. So let's try that. Property. So this thing was property grid 1. That was the name of the control. And what does it have? How do you dump something in there? Is it? I think it is selected item, selected object. That's it. Selected object equals results dot. Now, how do we get the first thing out of that list that came back? Dot first. All right. I've got a good feeling about this. So here's our interface. Now, there's got to be a way to make this a little bit prettier. I'm not sure. And then notice this looks almost exactly like the properties panel over here, where we've got all our panels, the properties of the controls that we enter. And let's put in a city, Chicago, and click search. And oh, look at that. That's too cool. So now instead of having this thing in one row, we've got it in, or two rows, table, kind of the column headers followed by that one row of data. Now we've got the thing kind of oriented vertically. It just looks a little bit better. Plus we got these little controls on top of here so we can kind of flip stuff around. Anyway, there you go. I hope this has kind of impressed upon you the power of Linq. We've now worked on we've used Linq to work on objects in memory. We've used Linq to work on XML data or data that was loaded from XML files. We've now used Linq to connect to a database file, or we could have just as easily connected to a database. So hopefully you see that Linq is very, very powerful because it's just one technology that you can use to perform database-like operations on many, many different types of data sources. So there you go. I mean, the rest of this is just kind of, fill in the gaps. It's just cut and paste and modify. So I don't know. There you go. I hope you found this useful. Linq, I struggled with it at first. I couldn't really absorb the syntax because it's not very, it's not an imperative programming language like C#. But once you kind of realize that it's just SQL queries flipped upside down, and you can apply that language to all these different data sources, suddenly all this stuff that used to be very, very tedious now becomes very easy. So I hope this has impressed upon you the power of Linq.